Welcome to the Unworthy Leader podcast, a show that shatters the illusion of perfect leadership. Here we expose the flaws, doubts, and insecurities behind the titles, proving that true leadership isn't about being worthy. It's about owning your unworthiness and leading anyway. If you're tired of the polished facades, you've come to the right place. You'll hear the raw truth from leaders you admire and trust. I'm Kendra Dahlstrom, your host and executive coach to the Fortune 500 C-suite. Let's get started. Welcome to the Unworthy Leader podcast. I'm your host, Kendra Dahlstrom, and today I have the pleasure of introducing Jorge Titinger. Jorge is the founder and CEO of Tintincher Consulting. He has over 35 years of experience in high-tech industry, focusing on strategy, leadership transformation, mergers and acquisitions. It's a pleasure to have him here. Personally, I know Jorge because he was a former CEO that I had the pleasure of working for and with. Jorge, it's great to have you here today. Thank you for joining me.
Thanks, Kendra. Thanks for having me. Really looking forward to this.
Thank you. I love working with CEOs in this capacity because you have been one that has, over the years that I've known you, really been an open book. You've really been more, willing to be vulnerable and share what that journey, to becoming a C-suite looks like. And then also what it's like for you today as a consultant working back on several boards and writing books. And so this whole topic around imposter syndrome or feelings of unworthiness or self-doubt and how it shows up and how it can impact our ability to execute is really important to me. It's something from my own personal story I've struggled with, and it vacillates between extreme and almost non-existent depending on where I'm at in my life and what's going on. And so the fact that you were willing to come and talk about this topic with me really meant a lot. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, and it's funny because it's something that I think most people have experienced at some point in their lives, right? Their careers or whatnot. And those who have never experienced it are probably unicorns. They find it difficult to believe that somebody doesn't. And the trick is to recognize it and overcome it, right? But yeah, let's get into some of the details.
Yeah, take us back a little bit for those that haven't had the pleasure of knowing you, Jorge, and tell us a little bit about your life, where you come from. I know you played a professional sport at one point, and what led you into your career, and then we can talk about how self-doubt showed up in that journey.
Yeah, great question. So I am born and raised in Peru. I lived there through high school, and so I left after high school to go to college in the US, and I had the pleasure of being recruited to play soccer at Stanford University. So I played all 4 years. And by the way, we'll talk a little bit about that because that's a place, in the world of sports where it's easy for this to show up. And if you don't overcome it, it's problematic, as you can imagine. So, I played soccer there. I studied electrical engineering and philosophy as an undergraduate. And then I got recruited to play pro. And so I played for what was the last season of the North America Soccer League, because literally under a year after I joined the team, the whole league went bankrupt. So I'm like, there went one of those dreams. And it's funny because I didn't want to start working yet. So I went back to school. I got a master's in computer science. And then I started my career, right? And so I had I'm going to say the luck of being my first real job after soccer was working for Hewlett Packard. And, this is the late 80s, right? I mean, I'm aging myself now. HP was phenomenal as a place to start your career, because in addition to giving you very challenging and awesome work opportunities, they kept educating you, right? They kept training you both on your trade, right? So technical training, if you will, and at the same time, how to deal with humans, right? And so it was really a terrific experience. And worked there for a long time. They decided to move my division. And that's when I decided actually that I didn't want to move from where I was living, and joined another company that was a startup in late stage startup, if you will, that very fairly quickly combined with Silicon Graphics. So I joined a company called MIPS that joined with Silicon Graphics. And Silicon Graphics back then was like it was the darling of Silicon Valley. It was super innovative, cool, right? The campus that we had is where Google is now, right? And so it was a really great place to work. And then, I actually switched industry. So I had about half my career was in the high-end computing industry and the other half in the semiconductor equipment industry. And I had the good luck of working for some of the best companies in that space as well, right? I worked at Applied Materials, KLA, Tencor, and then Verigy, where I got to be the CEO of Verigy. And interestingly enough, after Verigy, we had a very successful transaction with Verigy, and I was going to start doing what I do today, but I got tapped by SGI people asking me to come and lead a turnaround of Silicon Graphics, which I accepted because I figured, when are you going to get an opportunity to actually go take a brand like that and kind of bring it back to prominence?
Mm-hmm.
And the funny thing is, so I did that. We ended up being acquired by HP. So when I looked at my career, I go, first real job in SGI, then SGI, HP. So it was perfectly bracketed, and that's when I said, I can't take an operating role anymore. Cannot, disturb that harmony. But throughout my career, I progressed fairly quickly in the moving from individual contributor through management to director, VP, and then eventually the C-suite. And I learn a lot more, I think, from things that don't go well. So if you actually are able to take I don't want to call it a failure because it's something that didn't go well, and learn from that, it becomes a very powerful way of becoming better, right? When
Mm-hmm.
everything goes well, you're not sure if you're just lucky or awesome or maybe a little bit of both, right? So yeah, and the combination with HP happened at the very end of 2016. I stayed for a short amount of time helping with the integration of the two companies. And then I started doing what I do today, which, I launched Tintincher Consulting. I serve on a number of boards, public, private, nonprofits. And at the same time, I work with companies, mostly C-suites or boards. And my focus is on how do you get your human capital to be your biggest competitive advantage? Throughout my career, it became pretty obvious to me that um, it was about the team and it was about the culture. And I love that saying, culture eats strategy for breakfast. I really do believe it's so that focus has not only exposed me to a number of folks that have experienced this imposter syndrome. And at the same time, for example, when I started my first time working with a different industry that I was used to, or a different country or whatnot, experiencing it myself, right? It's like, am I really ready for this? Do I know what I'm doing? Et cetera, et cetera. And so, yeah, I mean, it's been a career that's, for me at least, I describe it as, I'm actually very happy with my career. So I'm, achieved a lot of success. And at the same time, it's not been a straight line up and to the right, right? As a matter of fact, I call it the crooked path of my career. I wanted to be a professional soccer player. I got to do that for a little bit, then I had to start working. So anyway, I'll stop there and see.
Thank you for sharing all of that. I want to touch on something you just said, and then I want to go back to the
Mhm.
software because I think that's a really just ripe opportunity to talk about all of this and how it shows up because of um, the element of also how you're validated. But it's something that you just said, even in your consulting practice today, working with a new industry or maybe a new kind of nonprofit or, just a dynamic that you haven't been in before, even having some sense of, okay, I want to take this slowly. Like, I want to make sure I know what I'm doing. Can you walk us through how you moved through that and realized that it was okay to keep going?
Yeah. Yeah. So I'm gonna back up a little bit, right?
Sure.
So my interpretation of what imposter syndrome is really a psychological pattern where people think they're not good enough, right? And they're afraid of
Mm-hmm.
being exposed as a fraud, right? And like I said, I think most people experience it at some point in their lives, right? And so and including super successful people. So this is not just somebody who's, not too accomplished. I mean, it happens everywhere. And so for me, and again, these are lessons from the world of sports, right? For me, it was kind of first of all, you need to acknowledge it. I think it starts there, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you're not able to acknowledge it, it's very difficult to do anything about it. So in almost everything that we do, the first step is to recognize that whatever that is exists, right? And then it's for me, it was very easy to say, look, I'm going to focus on the facts, right? So I've been successful in industry X, industry Y, industry Z. And the approach that I take when I work with people is very similar. You spend a period of time of grounding yourself, understanding what the issues are, kind of setting a baseline. And then from there, based again on your experience, expertise, whatnot, setting a path for improvement. And so, making it clear that it wasn't any different in a different industry. Of course, the particulars were very different, but the process was the same. And I had gone through that process successfully many times in the past. And the reason why I'm linking it to sports is because I always look for fast feedback, right? And it's one of the things that in the world of sports, like you said, all you have to do is look at the scoreboard. You know if you're
Right.
doing well or not, right? And unfortunately, although it's getting better, right? But when I started my career, I mean, some projects, R&D or IT projects would take 2 years, and you didn't know until the end of the 2 years if it was
Mm-hmm.
successful or not. So I always look in the work that I do, and I try to instill it in the companies that I ran to set up milestones where you can actually know how you're doing, right? So before all the concepts of agile development or scrums for work and all that, we were doing this in my companies. We just didn't have the names for it, right? But I think it's super important, and I think I'll relate a story a little later about somebody who worked for me who had a bad case of imposter syndrome. The person was phenomenal, right? But for me, the ability to overcome it really starts with that recognition, right? Then to reframe how you're thinking about it and replace the I don't belong with a recognition of you've done it before, right? Or something very similar. And, I really don't like performance reviews in companies. I think they're awkward, right? I think that ought to be a conversation that happens all the time. But the only benefit that you get is you can go back and read and say, oh, wow, yeah, yeah, I accomplished this and I
Yeah.
accomplished that. And so start building your confidence again that you can do very good things. Um, Now, I'm going to put an asterisk in one of these. You do have to have skills. You do have to want to work. Otherwise, maybe you are an imposter. So, I mean, and one of the things that I work with executive teams that I get to consult with or not is to really I work on a pyramid of competence, right? And I encourage them to realize that competence is domain specific, right? So if you're great in finance, doesn't mean you're great in sales, right? And unfortunately, the way that the media sells things to us, especially in the Western world, it kind of leads us to believe that just because you know something really well in an area, that means you're good at everything. So I
Yeah.
encourage people, especially CEOs, to declare themselves beginners when they're entering new domains of expertise, right? But the pyramid doesn't start at beginner. There's so you go from beginner to minimally competent, competent, expert, master, right? But there's areas below beginner, right? Where people who really are not competent and know it, and they still act in that domain, right? Well, they're aware they don't know. So I
Right.
call
It's
them
deliberate.
deliberate. Then you have the innocent, right, who doesn't know they don't know and act in that domain. And unfortunately, those are dangerous. There's the bull in the china shop syndrome, right?
I,
Yeah. And then there's the responsible incompetent who knows they don't know and chooses not to act in that domain. So, you might get into one of those areas, and I think it's super important back to recognize that you're experiencing this, recognize either you need to declare yourself a beginner and really go and learn, or understand that you can act in that domain because you are at least competent and then act in that domain. So I'm not sure if I've confused things or not, but it's, if you think about it, that pyramid of competence, and as you're moving up, you're granted permission to act in some of those domains. In the early stages, you need supervision.
One of the things I often have found, instead of being paralyzed by these feelings of fear and imposter syndrome or self-doubt, I think what really distinguishes real leadership are people who don't let that stop them. They don't become paralyzed. So
Yeah.
they take an action towards, right, what the
Yes.
goal is. And so that oftentimes means you have to acquire skills or knowledge, or to your point, admit that maybe I don't know this, but I'm going to bring in people around me who
Yeah.
are experts that know. And that's what I'm hearing. I think you say is like, that's how you actually get from the pre-beginner category of acknowledging that, hey, I'm really a beginner in this domain and I need to acquire these skills and this knowledge in order to do this. And I can bring in these people around me to help support me to get there.
Exactly.
And really being transparent and vulnerable in sharing that versus the people
Exactly.
who just sort of fake it till you make it and then they become a huge risk.
And you touch upon a very important point, right? When I work with individuals as they're progressing in their career, I talk to them about some of the key objectives is how do you actually increase your power? And I define power as the relative capacity to generate effective action. So it's
That's good.
relative because if you're in a group of superstars, if you're also a superstar, you're normal,
That's
right?
right.
So
Relative
it
capacity to
needs to be
achieve.
differentiated,
Say it
right?
again.
Relative capacity to generate effective action. And I use the word effective because you could generate a lot of activity that is just busy work that produces no results, right? So effective action is one that produces results.
Mm-hmm.
And then we spend time talking about what are the sources of power, right? So obviously your education, your health, your body. But one of the most important ones is your networks.
Mm-hmm.
And the objective of having power to generate effective action is that you need to eventually be able to make an assessment that you have, the ability to take care of all your concerns. And so, for example, I grew up in a family of doctors, right? They're all medical doctors. And for a period of time, like back to the imposter syndrome, I consider myself, man, I'm the lowly business guy in this family, if not worth it. But I have no idea about medicine. But in my network, I have doctors, right? Yes, I do understand finance quite well, given the roles that I had. But I have somebody who helps me with my taxes. All of those things that are, you have tactical networks, you have discursive networks, you have a network of support or love, your family, your friends who, are there for you. They're super important to take care of your concerns. And so, like you said, leveraging your networks is a great way to overcome the fact that you might be a beginner in a certain domain.
Yeah, I love that. And got me thinking as you were talking about giving yourself what you need, right, in order to be successful from a community standpoint.
Yeah. So the word that I normally use is autonomy,
Mm-hmm.
right? And autonomy is your own assessment that you can take care of your concerns, right? And the you is with all capital letters, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is you personally, all your networks, is a broader you. And this is why I think it's so important, especially for people who are growing in their careers and younger people who are starting their careers, to be purposeful about developing their networks and understanding what it takes to be in a network, right? Because you
Yeah.
want it to be you want it to be reciprocal. It doesn't need to be, the give and take doesn't need to be the same, right? But there needs to be a little bit of that. Otherwise, if somebody's only taking, they're gonna not be in somebody else's network for very long.
Yeah.
You know?
Well, and what immediately that has me thinking about is just the pandemic and then also social
Yeah,
media and how we're seeing reclusive
yeah,
behavior from people. And no wonder people are feeling, depressed or,
yeah,
like imposters and frauds. And, we're seeing sort of this rise in self-doubt. It definitely makes me think about
yeah,
with what you're saying that there, is a connection there, especially for young people.
yeah. Well, think
Yeah.
about it when the kids that were born during the pandemic, right? Um, the natural, I think, the natural tendency for little kids and babies is to be social and play and
That's
hug and
right.
stuff. And for a year plus, they were told, oh, nobody
Yeah.
can touch you. Don't. So I hope it doesn't have a permanent impact on that generation, but knock on wood, it could.
Yeah.
And we've lost to a great extent the body language, right? The ability to actually read it and see it. And so we need to figure out how to replace that, I think, because it's it gave so many clues in interactions between humans
Oh.
when you could see somebody, like focus or
Hmm.
arms crossed, and all of that is kind of gone, right? And I still think there's will people go back to in person, or I think the reality is going to be some kind of hybrid. The in person will be part of it, and the remote will be also part of it going forward. But it impacts trust. So, yeah, it's it's one of so I know we're going to talk a little bit about my book, I think. And in the second book, one of the chapters is trust, from imperative to imperiled, because of the changes in what happened driven by the pandemic.
I saw that trend as well, just in on the leadership development side, is
Mhm.
I called it the trust gap. And I realized that for right or wrong or indifferent, that when leaders didn't get to see their people in the office every day, or that they were a lot more like, what are they doing? They're working from home. It really kind of exposed like where leaders may not necessarily trust their people, or where they may not have that foundation in place as a team and for the one-on-ones or whatever it is they
Yeah,
need to have that trust. And I'm
yeah,
not saying and advocating that people should be working from home the whole time. I'm just saying it really exposed sort of some of those in any team, where the trust is really not there. Because for people to be at home full time working, you really have to have trust.
yeah. I think there are studies that show that actually, in a lot of cases, productivity improved. There
Yeah,
were
which is
less
fascinating.
distractions. It's like anyway, so you probably end up working longer hours, et cetera, et cetera. But
Yeah.
yeah,
But the
absolutely.
relationship, there's still something missing there, right?
Mhm.
So I love that. So
Yeah.
yeah, let's get into your book.
Yes, I co-wrote them. And the first one was called Differences That Make a Difference, and it was about the impact that DEI had on the bottom line of companies, right? And I
Hmm.
co-wrote it with Pedro Espinosa, who's a millennial, which is why I have gray hair. No, it was a great experience, but it was funny actually. It really highlighted the very different way that different generations view the world, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we interviewed about 130, 140 leaders about this topic. Um, and I know that those three letters are, very controversial today. So
Today they are, yes.
yeah, I wanna make a note here that the focus that we had was, DEI, not for the check the box, right? The
That's right.
real spirit of it, which was really about diversity of thought, diversity of experience, diversity of perspectives adds a lot to positive outcomes, right? It wasn't we need to have three of these and four of those, and that
Yeah.
that certainly wasn't the focus of the book. And our intention was to write a second book a few years later on how much progress there had been. And well, guess what? The pandemic happened. And so the second book was about, well, now with the pandemic, how has this whole thing changed? For example, that one chapter on trust, trust became way more difficult to achieve because for most of us, we relied on the one-to-one communication or the one-to-many, but in person, right, where you could see body language, you could interpret it. And that was kind of different. And then the other thing that came out in the second book was, who do you include? Because it was diversity, inclusion, equity, and then belonging. And then it was like, well, who do you include, right? So is it diversity of age, diversity of economic background, religious
Mm-hmm.
experience? I mean, anything. And, the focus in a lot of companies was gender and ethnicity. It wasn't about true diversity of experience.
Right. Coming from Peru, I can imagine you have like a completely different experience and
It
perspective
was
to
interesting.
share.
Yeah, it's funny because I think you and I talked a little bit about my family upbringing, right? And, I grew up, thank God, on a great family that was very open, very nurturing, high achievers. My father was a successful business guy. My mother was a medical doctor, right? And then she's 92 now. She's still alive and she's doing great. But imagine 70 some years ago in a South American country, that was not common, right? And
Right.
because especially if you belong to the middle class or upper middle class, you know, women were supposed to marry. And she had a vocation. She wanted to be a doctor, right? So to some extent in my family, if you look at the accomplishment levels, yeah, my dad was successful as a business guy, but more prestigious to be a doctor, right? So I
Mhm.
grew up in that environment where there was never a question in my mind of can women do whatever they set their minds to go do? And it really wasn't until I was in college, and I said that my undergraduate degree was in electrical engineering. And I think as a freshman, we had about 200 double E's in my class, and three were women. And I'm going like, where are all the women? I wasn't exposed to this issue of women in technology being, you know, problematic back then until I got to the US. Um, I had the good fortune of going to a English speaking school since I was a kid. So I know I have an accent, but I don't have the typical Hispanic. I did not. And,
Had that
and,
support.
um, and I'll tie it back to the world of sports again. But so I don't, my ancestry ethnically is all European. So I have zero native blood, if you will,
Mhm.
South American blood. So, I don't look like you would imagine a typical Latino. I don't sound like one, but I am 100%
Mhm.
Latino, right? And so it was very interesting. People would get confused. They were like, "Are you Irish? Are you this? Are you that?" It was like, and if I ever said no, I'm from Latin America, they immediately thought, "Oh, you're Argentine," right? Because there's
Mhm.
such a large European immigration in Argentina. But I remember this is the early 80s, right? I had played for the Peruvian junior national team soccer, right? So when I came to college, my level of soccer was quite high compared to
It's amazing.
the other kids. So I had that as a very high achievement thing in my life, which gave me confidence for pretty much everything else, right? So I don't think I experienced, am I ready for the rigor of a school like Stanford, right? Which was, I didn't know when I applied to college that these were really tough schools to go to, right? Exactly. And it was one of those things where they were known, right? So what schools we knew in Peru, was the Ivies, Stanford, all the Florida schools because Lima is closest to Florida. So I didn't even have the angst of, man, I'm applying to really tough schools. I just applied. And so, academics came easy to me, which was also it's a blessing and a curse, right? Because you know, as I moved towards my junior, senior years, I really had to change my study habits because at the beginning I didn't. And so that got exposed, and then luckily I had back from the world of sports. You got to train hard, you got to persevere. I also did martial arts for 17
Mhm.
years, and that was even more disciplined in the approach, and so I was able to actually change my study habits fairly easily. But um, so and of course I cannot pinpoint at anything, but yeah, there were tell you a story. I took an electromagnetics class right as a sophomore, and the professor who taught the class was the preeminent professor of electromagnetics in the world. Right, every school in the world used his book, and he was at a different level intellectually than all of us. Right, so I think the average score in the first midterm was like 25%. We're all like, oh my, what happened here? Right. So as you can imagine, going to the second one, we were all like, I'm not worthy. Right. Yeah. And now he got a message, right? And that obviously there was something, the average on the second midterm was like 90 something. So, but we ended up learning electromagnetics. But, there's situations like that, right? Where all of a sudden you go, oh, wow. I thought I was very good or that, and then you have a setback, and that creates that self-doubt, right? And it back to my earlier message, it's super important to recognize what it is, right? Recognize that you can go get back on the habits and the practices that you have to actually do better, and then take action. So
Yeah.
action is one of the cures, I think, for
Moving through it,
now.
right?
Remember what I said, effective action.
That's right. It's choosing not
Yeah.
to do
Or
anything.
or activity, right?
Mm-hmm. Or just keeping busy,
Activity.
doing
Yeah,
anything but the thing you're supposed to, you want to do, but you're avoiding it.
exactly.
I've been guilty of that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
have a
that's,
I have a third degree in procrastination, but
well, gosh, I didn't know that you did mixed martial arts as well. So that's
yeah.
fascinating that there's a lot of parallels between what I know of the mindset that's required to do martial arts
Yeah.
and then the soccer, playing soccer, and then what you've shared with us about your career. As you work, with leaders, I think at this point it's probably been thousands of leaders that you've worked with over the years. And in your consulting business, you told us about action. Is there anything else that you would sort of call people to do to help us create a community to overcome
Yeah.
this?
Um, so it goes kind of back to networks, right? And I think it's acknowledging that you're going through that is important. I think sharing with your trusted networks that you're going through that is important because they may have gone through something similar. They may know you in a way that maybe you don't even know yourself to coach you. So to some extent, it's about how do you actually regain psychological safety so that you can take action? Because being in that state actually paralyzes you, right? And so the key is how do you get paralyzed for the shortest amount of time? One of them is recognize it, share it with your trusted networks, move move the conversation in your head from feelings to facts. I think that's important,
Mm-hmm.
right? So when you start looking at facts and you go, well, for example, right, in the example I gave you with electromagnetics, part of it was, I got an A in this, that, and that. And so there's no reason why I couldn't do well in that particular course.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and maybe I need to change the way I approach the studies or go to the TA. In my head it was uncool to go to the TA, right? That's
Right. To ask
one
for
of
help, right?
yeah, that's one of the symptoms of imposter syndrome, right? Where
Mm.
you think that if you ask for help, that means you're a failure, right?
That's
That's so I think there's several manifestations of imposter syndrome. One of them is that one, right? I think technically it's called the soloist, right? The whole thing about men never ask for directions if they're lost in the car, right? It's the same thing, right? It's not because you don't want to get to the place you want to get to, is you don't want to appear that you failed, right?
mm.
So I think again, recognize it, leverage your network, shift
Yeah.
from feelings to facts, and then commit yourself to actually do something about it, right? I tell people, keep an achievement journal that you can refer to, right? Because there's people who may fall into this very seldom and others who may fall into this very often. If
Mm-hmm.
you are one of those who falls into this very often, keep an achievement journal. Go back to it and read, oh yeah, remind yourself that you are competent, but in the domains that you're competent, what did you do to get there? Right? And replicate whatever those practices might be. Um,
That's a
so
great
anyway, I don't
one.
know if that's
Yeah, no, the journal's great because one thing that I've uncovered, at least in my coaching work over the last decade, was when I talk with leaders, I find that they often take things that come very easy for them for granted. And then
yeah,
it kind of creates this delta with their team. Like, gosh, this is so easy. And it's just something that either they've learned to do or something that just comes natural to them that they don't understand why the other people, why can't they do it?
yeah,
But in that same vein, and what you just shared is, that is something that can be in an achievement journal. It's like sometimes there's these things that we can do that we don't think are a big deal, but if others look at it from the outside in, they're like, that's actually a pretty big deal.
Yeah.
And to your point earlier on, I think that's one benefit of performance reviews is sometimes it gives you a chance to write things down. And as you write it, you say, well, I don't know that this is that big of a deal. I was just doing my job. And then as you write it out, you're like, oh, this actually was really
Yeah.
beneficial for the company.
Yeah.
So yeah, I love the journal idea.
And then for leaders, or if you're leading people who might get into it, um, this is why I said I'm going to tell you a story. And so I'm not going to use real names, but Company X, I was the COO of the company. The CIO reported to me. No, sorry. The person who was assigned to me from the IT department reported to me. The CIO of the company left. And at the C level, we talked about, should we go outside? Should we do something from within? And I said, look, I think the person who's reporting to me would be a great CIO for the company. And, I think my message had such conviction that my other C-level peers said, okay, let's give it a try. So I went to talk to this guy. And I said, hey, I think we want to make you the CIO of the company. He panicked.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not ready, I'm going to
Mm-hmm.
screw up. And I had to go back and say, well, let's look at our journey together in this particular role, right? Walk them through that. In the end, I say, well, you don't have a choice. This is not, you're going to do it, right? Um, so he did a phenomenal job. Since then, he has been the CIO of two of the largest, most recognized companies in the world. I'm not gonna use names,
Fascinating.
right?
Yeah.
He is currently the CIO of a fruit company, hint, hint. And it's not a real fruit, but and this is a path on somebody who really was not able to recognize how good he was and was full of self-doubt, even though he had been performing terrific,
Right.
and needed that push to actually step into the role and do it. Now, if you're a leader of a group and whatnot, it doesn't need to be that dramatic of a story. But what I tell people, because there's a lot of people that work for you that will come for your blessing on every single decision that they ought to be making. So at some point, I go, okay, you decide. And sometimes they have a hard time deciding, right? And I said, okay, let's review the last 5 decisions that you made, that you came to me for agreement. Did they work? Yeah. Did I change anything? No. Right? And so you go through the fact that they've been making those decisions already. Now, of course, this has to be the case. Otherwise, you don't go through that process. And then you help them cut the umbilical cord, because if they're pulling you into their work, then you're not able to do your work
That's
as
right.
the leader, right? And so there's small practices like that. The achievement journey is one where either they're keeping it or you're keeping it, right, for them.
Mm-hmm.
But that again goes back to facts, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the fact that you completed assignment X, Y, or Z on time, on budget 6 times, chances are you're going to do this next one on time, on budget. So go for it.
Yeah.
And it starts building their confidence, because I think a lot of it is about regaining confidence in an honest way, right? So
Mm-hmm.
remember, I declare myself a beginner a lot when I enter new domains, because part of it is also I want to enter new domains
Yeah.
completely, right? You don't have to be the expert on everything. And when you say, hey,
Mm-hmm.
I'm learning, people, by the way, they're way more willing to share with you
Yeah.
than when you're not. You used the words earlier, vulnerability and transparency, right? Those are essential, I think, for good leadership,
Yeah.
because if you are not showing yourself as vulnerable in any way, shape, or form, it's very hard for people to trust you.
Yeah. It's almost like a sixth sense. People can sense it
Yeah.
and then
Yeah.
they start getting into self-preservation mode. So
Yeah.
this has been so helpful, Jorge. How can people get in touch with you if they're interested in your consulting services or ordering your books?
Sure. And so I'm on LinkedIn. I'm
Okay.
pretty sure I'm the only Jorge Titinger. So that's the name to use. And then my website is Tintincher Consulting. So they
I'll
can
put it
look
in the
for
show
those.
notes as well.
Yeah. And yeah, I mean, I love working with individuals that are committed to getting better. And I love working with companies that want to grow or are going through transformations, especially if they recognize their human capital is their biggest asset and want to make it one of their competitive advantages.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that aspect of it because I think for so long it was all about technology, who's first to market, speeds, all of that, right? And
But
and in that,
even in that story, what was behind that technology, right? What was
that's right.
behind time to market? What was behind the processes? It's
Yeah.
always been about the people.
One last question. If it's about the people, how do you see AI changing that?
Yeah, no, that's fine. That's a great question, by the way, and it's a very, very, very relevant topic today, right? And it's funny because in my first job, when I was at Hewlett Packard, I had a group that reported to me in Bristol, England, that was doing artificial intelligence. And so I call AI the 60-year instant success. But what is truly new is generative AI. And so that is not that old, and it's been enabled by the compute capability that exists today that before didn't. So you can actually run LLMs that have trillions of parameters, right? And so the hardware that's enabled is finally exists, and we see that it's pervasive, right? AI is getting into absolutely anything. And I was at a conference about 6 months ago talking about AI and the potential uses of AI and how to use it in a responsible way, right? Because while it's, I think, has an opportunity to phenomenally improve the way we work and the way we engage with computers, there's a potential dark side of it that if it's used for bad purposes. But so in this conference, somebody in the audience raised their hand and they said, I'm very worried that AI is going to replace my job. And my answer to the person was, you shouldn't be worried about AI replacing your job. You should be worried about the person who really knows how to use AI replacing your job. So I think there really is a call to action for everybody to get conversant, at least, in what it is and what it can do and how to use it well. I view AI still much more as a human assist than a
Yes.
human replacement.
Hmm.
So back to learn how to use it, learn how to actually improve or accelerate the ability for you to produce good output by leveraging AI. And I think we need to be very mindful of how and govern it inside of companies in a way that minimizes the risk of it being used potentially in negative ways. And I think we haven't seen everything that it can do yet.
Yeah.
But it really democratizes the engagement that humans have with computers, right? So
Hmm.
I did a quick demo in one of these presentations I had where, I said like, you know, I want a keto diet, right? So I went and asked, give me a keto diet. Gave me a thing. I said, well, okay, so I want it to be only, I don't remember, 2,000 calories a day. So he tweaked the thing. He said, well, I want to be able to buy all these things that you're saying here in my local market. So then it gave me the thing. And I want you give me recipes for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And it gave me that. And it took me maybe 5 minutes, right? Before generative AI, you needed to be a data scientist to actually go do that. And it probably would take you weeks, right? And so now if you can ask questions, you can leverage AI. Now, the better you get at asking those questions and the better you get at the prompts, the more value you can get out of it. But now you don't need to be a data scientist or data analyst to actually leverage it. And of course, the people who have that capability, they're going to continue to revolutionize what AI can do. So they're still very, very, very important. I'm not trying to minimize the importance of that, but for tasks that are more simple and more mundane, any one of us can do it. So my recommendation on that is get familiar with it, play with
Yeah.
it, learn how to use it. Be mindful that whatever you put into the LLMs is the public domain, and
Hmm.
so you know guard your private information. But but I think it's terrific that this is happening.
Fascinating. Thank you so much, Jorge. Thank you for joining us. I look forward to having you back, and thank you for being with us today.
Thank you, Kendra. Take care, everybody. Hope you enjoy the podcast.
A sincere thank you for tuning into the Unworthy Leader podcast, where we embrace imperfection as the leadership strength. I hope today's conversation challenged and inspired you to lead authentically. Together, we're breaking down imposter syndrome and redefining leadership through vulnerability and courage. For show notes, bonus content, and leadership resources, please visit theunworthyleaderpodcast.com. You can follow us on YouTube at The Unworthy Leader Podcast, LinkedIn at Kendra Dahlstrom. Until next time, lead authentically.